And joining me now in our studio to reflect a little more on the life of President George H.W. Bush are New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd, presidential historian Michael Beschloss, Bush family friend David Bates, who worked in the Bush 41 White House, and until recently, our former chief foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Warner. She's now a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Hello to all of you. What a day it has been. I have to say, it was a state funeral, but it was as personal to me as any official thing I've ever seen. There were accolades, there was humor, and there were tears. I mean, I was wiping away tears here at our anchor desk. Maureen Dowd, what did you take away today?
Well, Judy, it was heartwarming to see W's incredible emotion toward his father, but it was also kind of heartbreaking because you know, I've spent decades covering the family, and the father, you know, constantly worried that Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld were leading W astray on the Iraq War, and the neocons were leading him astray. And I think W did not want to seek his father's advice or hear what he had to say about the invasion of Iraq. And then it took years and years before he came around and realized his father was right and distanced himself from Rumsfeld and Cheney. But by that time, it was too late. It was the worst mistake in American foreign policy. So, you know, to see all that emotion, you just wish that, you know, they had been more mentor and protege during the time when he needed it.
A lot of complex strands running through that relationship and his relationship with others in his family. Margaret Warner, you also covered him as a candidate. You covered, you've known the Bush family. Did they capture the complexity of George Bush today?
I think it's very hard to capture the full complexity. I mean, the anecdotes are wonderful. I think perhaps what didn't come through is he also was a man of great ambition. I mean, he was very humble. I reported a long cover story for Newsweek years ago about how that came to be, how his mother would say, I don't want to hear more about the great I am, and his father wanted, the great he cared about does not claim more than his fair share of attention. So it was, on the one hand, hard for him to put himself forward. On the other hand, he was very ambitious, and he set his sights for something, and just as on that plane, he was determined to get there, even after losing in 79, 80 as a candidate in his own right.
David Bates, you know the family going back many years. You worked for him in several of his campaigns. You were in the White House when he was there. Did the George Bush you knew come through?
Yes, it did. I thought it was a wonderful service. To me, there was a great feeling of love in the cathedral. And I think that was appropriate because he is a beloved figure. And I thought each speaker offered a unique perspective on his life and character. And I thought it, as difficult as it is to capture a life, as Margaret said, of someone as complex as he is, and a life so full as his, I thought each of the speakers did a very good job of kind of encapsulating his life and character.
Michael Beschloss, you pay attention to a lot of presidents. How does remembering this one compare to what you remember of how we've reflected on and honored other presidents?
Well, I think, you know, every generation looks at a president a different way. And one thing that I love about this is that the George Bush that we've all been talking about during the last 4 days or so is very different from the George Bush that people were talking about in January 1993 when he was leaving office, and they were talking of him as out of touch. Many people were saying an inept president, shown by the fact that he couldn't even manage to win a second term, mismanager of the economy. Yes, he did end the Cold War, but we don't care about that anymore in 1993. 25 years later, you look back and see not only were these great historical achievements, but we see qualities in George Bush that were not appreciated at the time. The modesty, the ability to reach out to the other side, to try to include everyone. You know, every generation, as I say, looks for different things from a president. Here we are in the age of Donald Trump. of very confrontational politics, and the politics of George Bush seems like something that was light years ago, but perhaps may one day come back.
Maureen Dowd, Michael reminds us what a painful loss that was for him in the '92 election when he lost to Bill Clinton. You wrote this week about your wonderful correspondence with him, being in touch with him over the years. How did he work his way through that?
Oh, I think that was, that was very hard for him to take because he was at 90% after, the Persian Gulf War. And then one day in the press office, he sort of admitted that he had no interest in domestic policy. He really just loved being in that, global club, mostly men's club. And he really didn't want to deal with the domestic side. And I think he kind of missed the moment where Americans were getting anxious about, the economy and other things. And he just really gloried in the foreign affairs part of it.
But then as we were saying, I mean, he lost, but he managed to live a full life after that. And you, again, in that piece you wrote this week, you captured a lot of that. I mean, the humor came back, the zest for life came back.
Well, I think Michael's right. When we look at it through the prism of Donald Trump, one way to look at it is Bush Sr. would drop the first person pronoun, personal pronoun, because his mother always told him not to use the big I, not to gloat. So he would start sentences like the Dana Carvey imitation, can't act, just have to be me. He would drop the I. And then now we're living in this world that's all about the I with Donald Trump. The whole world is having to pivot to Trump's narcissistic I. And, one heartbreaking thing was when in Bush's book of letters, he wrote a letter to his sons, and he said, if you ever need to distance yourself from me when you're running, don't feel bad about it.
Wow. Margaret Warner, you were part of a story that lives in history. You were a reporter for Newsweek magazine, and you had done a lot of reporting about his campaign in the 1980s when he was planning on running for president. And your editor at Newsweek gave it the title of The Wimp Factor.
Or Fighting the Wimp Factor.
Fighting the Wimp Factor. Tell us about that and his reaction to it.
What I'd spent almost a year doing and speaking to every member of the family was trying to get at why this person, this man who was courageous in his day as a young man who achieved so much, that there was this image problem that he wasn't his own man. He didn't want to separate himself from Ronald Reagan and so on. And I really got, I think, at the nub of his character, including the self-effacement and why he never uses the word I. And then, because I think Newsweek, they just wanted to jazz it up. They wanted to make a splash. Sure. And so
we've never known the news media to do that.
Never happens.
So it came out the day he announced, and it was just devastating to the family. His daughter Doro who had spent time with me, burst into tears. In any event, he then, and so I was in agony about it because I did feel it was cruel and gratuitous. I wrote to him, and amazingly, one day at home, he called me. And I don't actually recall every detail, but I do recall him saying, there's one person in this household who won't forgive and forget, Barr.
His wife, Barbara.
His wife, Barbara Bush. Yeah.
David Bates, we're trying to capture in just a few minutes, again, the complexity of this man with the humor, the tough thing, and the fact that he almost died when he went into the Pacific, what John Meacham was remembering today. And yet, in the end, he did a lot as president. I mean, he was only there, he was there for 4 years, but he was managing a foreign policy at a time when Europe was, the world was changing at the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, he managed to pull off a lot.
He did. He was a very consequential president, and I think Secretary Jim Baker said it best, and he's certainly the best one-term president the country's ever had, and I agree with him. He's one of the most outstanding presidents we've ever had. But his record in foreign policy is well known to many. Ending the Cold War without a shot being fired, which probably unique in history. Reunification of Germany, which was opposed by most leaders of Western Europe. We know about the first Gulf War and how successful the diplomacy was in that. But on the domestic side, Clean Air Act amendments, which essentially ended acid rain,
yeah.
which was a very critical problem before that. Americans with Disability Act, which really put disabled people into the mainstream of society, and a very, very tough spending control piece of legislation, which also had, as Senator Simpson mentioned, some revenue increases.
Do you think he recognized what he was getting done?
I believe that by the in 92 after he lost, he may not have been recognized, you know, how successful his presidency was. But I do think that, and Senator Simpson alluded to it, that with some years looking back on his presidency, I think he was very, very pleased with how his. And the loss was very, very tough, but in a way, I don't think his sons would have been elected governor of Texas and Florida, or his son been elected president if he had won a second term. So,
Michael Beschloss, we're always asking historians, how do presidents weigh, again, compare to one another? It's too early, but what do you say now?
Well, during those 4 years, with 20/20 hindsight, the one thing I'd want from a president is that he makes the right decisions about ending the Cold War. He built this relationship with Gorbachev, made Gorbachev feel that Bush would not exploit him if Gorbachev opened the Berlin Wall, let Eastern Europe go, let Germany reunify within NATO. George Bush made some mistakes. He was not a perfect man. One thing that drives me crazy is that he did not do what effective presidents do, which is he couldn't explain to Americans when he was making unpopular decisions. Effective presidents can surmount that. But sum it all up, the one thing I'd want from him is what he did on the Cold War. No one else who could have been plausibly been president would have done that. So I think that qualifies George Bush to be thought of as at least a near great president, and certainly a very consequential one.
Maureen Dowd, quickly, I mentioned the piece you wrote this week reflecting on your long correspondence and relationship with him, reporter, politician. Capture for us how that went. I mean, the line, the confecto, I can't do justice to some of the language that he used in writing you.
Well, he just was trying to agonize. He would say, Dr. Freud, Dr. Young, Dr. Phil, help me. You know, he didn't understand how he could still maintain this correspondence with me when I was being so hard on his son. But he, as Margaret has pointed out, he was capable of great decency and forgiveness. And, you know, we just had this wonderful correspondence for decades. And, you know, he was a very special guy.
Margaret, just quickly, remembering him?
I agree with Maureen completely. There was this core, this decency and warmth and graciousness about him that really comes through in the letters to Maureen and back. Very much, but I also agree with Michael that I covered that whole period at the end of the Cold War and also the Gulf War. And that could have never been brought together, that coalition. I was with Jim Bakers, who went all around to try to put that together, if it weren't for Bush's personal relationships with these world leaders, and then, of course, later his willingness to end the war when he did.
In just a few seconds, Michael Beschloss, we'll still be talking about him years from now.
I think we will, and the great thing about history, it's an argument without end, so if you'll invite us back in 30 years, we can do this some more.
That's a promise.
Got a deal.
You'll all be back.
Thank you.
Michael Beschloss, Maureen Dowd, David Bates, Margaret Warner, thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Jim.